Welcome to Chain Reaction, the Foreign Policy Research Institute's flagship network of podcast series examining the political, security, economic, and social trends shaping Europe and Eurasia. Throughout the year, we're talking with experts about developments in Russia's war in Ukraine, the new European security order, the past, present, and future of the Baltic states, Russia's political economy, and great power competition in the region. Join us each month for
Bear Market Brief,
Baltic Ways,
Report in Short,
and of course, our flagship, Chain Reaction. New episodes are available each week on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. This week on Chain Reaction.
It has been 15 months since the Wagner Group's founder, Yevgeny Prigozhin, led the group's ill-fated march on Moscow, and 13 months since Prigozhin was killed in a plane crash, almost certainly orchestrated by the Kremlin. Prigozhin is gone, but his group lives on. In Africa and elsewhere, mercenaries from Wagner and other Russian groups continue to do the Kremlin's bidding and enrich themselves in the process. But their deeds and misdeeds carry a price for themselves and for Russia's reputation. 2 months ago, more than 80 Wagner fighters were killed in an ambush in northern Mali. To discuss Wagner's operations in Africa and elsewhere, I'm joined today on Chain Reaction by Colin Clarke, Chris Faulkner, and Raphael Parens. Colin Clarke is a non-resident senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute and is the director of research at the Wagner Group. Prior to joining the Wagner Group, Clarke was a professor at Carnegie Mellon University and a senior political scientist at the RAND Corporation, where he spent a decade researching terrorism, insurgency, and criminal groups. At RAND, Clarke led studies on ISIS financing, the future of terrorism and transnational crime, and lessons learned from insurgencies since the end of World War II. Clarke has a PhD in international security from the University of Pittsburgh. Christopher Faulkner is an assistant professor of national security affairs at the U.S. Naval War College. Previously, he was a postdoctoral fellow with the National Security Affairs Department at the Naval War College. Prior to joining the War College, he served as a postdoctoral researcher with the University of Central Florida and as a visiting assistant professor at Centre College. He earned his PhD in security studies from the University of Central Florida and was a Minerva Jennings Randolph Peace and Security Scholar with the U.S. Institute of Peace. Raphael Parens is the 2024 Templeton Fellow in the Foreign Policy Research Institute's Eurasia program. He is an international security researcher focused on Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. Parens specializes in small armed groups and NATO modernization processes. He received his MA in International Security Studies at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, and he's currently based in Brazzaville, Republic of Congo. Colin, Chris, and Rafi, thanks for joining me again on Chain Reaction to talk about the Wagner Group and Russia's role in Africa.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks.
So it's been 14 months since Wagner's aborted March on Moscow last June, and about a year since its founder, Yevgeny Prigozhin, was killed in a plane crash, certainly orchestrated by the Kremlin. What's Wagner up to today, or what's its status today? Let me start, Chris, with you.
Yeah, it's a great question, and there's a lot of change in a year. Obviously, we've seen the Kremlin attempt to commandeer and hollow out the Wagner organization as it was known, and reconstruct and reconstitute a new type of outfit for some of Wagner's legacy deployments, particularly in Africa. I think what we've seen is successful effort in taking over some of the economic enterprises that were the Prigozhin criminal network, and maybe a little bit less success in commandeering the military operations for legacy deployments in places like the Central African Republic. And I'll mention this, I don't think it's a homogenous type of success story or failure. What we've ultimately seen is it depends on the theater in which Wagner was operating, is how intentional the Kremlin was in trying to take over the Wagner enterprise. And I think, the big story here is Africa Corps. It's been the organization that has been stood up, kind of expanding what was Wagner's operations prior to Prigozhin's death, in places like Mali and the Central African Republic, but also entering new frontiers in places like Niger and Burkina Faso. And so that's kind of where we stand today, with a lot of unknowns and a lot of uncertainty of what the forecast looks like for continuity of Africa Corps and the Wagner legacy.
Okay, thanks. Rafi, let me turn to you. On the Africa Corps, the Russians announced the formation of Africa Corps earlier this year. Is this just Wagner rebranded? Are there other groups that have been folded into this? And I guess same question we always have with the Wagner Group is how much direct control does the Kremlin exercise over the Africa Corps?
Yeah, so the Africa Corps is, as its name suggests, more focused on expeditionary activities in Africa than it is, on Wagner's previous deployments in Ukraine or in Belarus. So it really is those operations, kind of expanding them, both as Chris said, into Burkina Faso and Niger. So that's kind of one approach. The problem is there's still these deployments in Mali and Central African Republic. And it's a little unclear exactly what they look like now and what they're going to look like forward in terms of whether they're controlled by Wagner Group or whether they're controlled by Africa Corps, and what really the difference is. Because right now it doesn't look like there's a lot of difference. The commanders are pretty much the same. They're rotating in new troops and new commanders for these deployments in Niger and Burkina Faso, but they look very similar to the guys who were working in Wagner Group before. So it's kind of new paint on the same product in a lot of ways. Perhaps now with a little bit more Russian state investment, although that's obviously going to run into the war in Ukraine and how much they're capable of deploying a lot of logistics and other types of support to Africa.
Yeah, and there's always been this sort of tension between control and deniability for the Kremlin, right? And like many things the Russian government is involved in, it's murky and it's stinky. But how? Let me turn to you, Colin, on the control versus deniability. The deniability, it seems like one always comes at the cost of the other. The more control the Kremlin has, the less deniability it has over what its private military contractors are doing. But they want a certain level of deniability. So how have they tried to square this circle? Are they doing anything really different now than they were when it was mostly just Wagner?
So I think the fact that we're having this conversation and we're talking about, have they rebranded? Are they undergoing a transition period? Shows that in some ways they've achieved going back to that kind of level of ambiguity that Putin had wanted, the type of obfuscation that they enjoyed early on. So, whether or not they're closer or more distant from Russian military intelligence and kind of Russian Ministry of Defense, it's almost like salvaging Wagner for parts, right? There's these really kind of lucrative pieces of Prigozhin's former empire that's now being kind of picked apart like a carcass. But I think the Russians very much are invested in Africa. They see it as an area for growth. And a lot of that's based on what we've seen already in terms of coups that have swept through a number of countries in the Sahel. And I think they see a great opportunity there. And I think the Russians actually, in some ways, understand the notion of great power competition better than the United States does. They're there competing in these areas that we've kind of just washed our hands and walked away from, and the French have done the same. We're constantly talking about great power competition, but it's playing out in areas like the Sahel and in Central Asia. And if you're not there, you can't compete.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And the Russians have tools maybe that we either can't or won't deploy to compete with us. Things like PMSCs that do these private military and security contractors that do actual combat, like Wagner and Redut and some of these others. Chris, let me ask you about this command and control question. This question of control versus deniability. What do you have to say on that?
Yeah, I think that one of the parts that maybe I glossed over at the beginning, and forgive me, I don't know if we talked about this in our previous conversation because there's been again a lot of churn with the Wagner organization. Is I think there's been that concerted effort to fold in the appendages of the Wagner Group, the last vestiges of it, under the Ministry of Defense, but in different ways, and that's where we've seen Yevgeny Prigozhin and Andrei Averinov, so the deputy defense minister and head of a GRU unit responsible for sabotage, I think is what most analysts have kind of described his role, kind of take over the both the overlord in a Yevgeny deputy defense minister, and more, and in a Varanov case, a head of the actual operational side of the Wagner / Africa Corps deployments now. So I think that's, to Colin's point, one of these ways in which we're trying to salvage the best of what Wagner offered. And it's hard to deny that it's connected to the Kremlin any longer. But as we get further removed from kind of this effort to commandeer, I kind of forecast, and I think all of us here are on the same page, an effort to revitalize that plausible deniability element, and how they've restructured it under a GRU kind of operator just suggests that that's really kind of the direction they're hoping to move.
Yeah, so we've mentioned Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, and Central African Republic. Where else is Wagner or the Africa Corps operating in Africa? Rafi, let me start with you.
Yeah. So there's some allegations that Wagner Group was or has continued to be involved in Sudan, supporting the RSF, which is the Rapid Support Forces, combating SAF, which is the sort of former government side. It's all a bit confusing because they were all part of the same government and then kind of split. So the allegation is that Wagner is supporting the RSF, both by training troops and then also by providing some equipment assistance. The confusing part is that the Russian state is in fact backing the SAF. So you have two different Russian factions kind of backing different sides in this conflict. So it looks a little bit like arms profiteering and war profiteering. Whether that's helping either side kind of accomplish their goals is anyone's guess. But that is the major other deployment besides Libya, which I think Colin can definitely talk about.
Yeah, well, let me turn to you on Libya then, Colin, please.
I think, when you look at the range of deployments that Wagner has undertaken, it's really fascinating on a couple of levels because to go back to something Tony Thomas used to always say, they're getting reps, right? They're out there doing things, and they're increasing interoperability in certain places because they're working on the ground with various militias, groups of foreign fighters that they're training, and they're doing a whole range of different activities. And so, in some ways, when you look at the way that Wagner was used in Ukraine, as real kind of cannon fodder and sent out there, there's other aspects of this, kind of network or organization that are really kind of cutting their teeth and gaining some critical skills, both combat and non-combat related, working alongside, special forces, working alongside, as they did in Syria, groups like Lebanese Hezbollah, kind of coming into contact with IRGC Quds Force. And so I think what we see on the tail end of this, whatever comes out next from Africa Corps and elsewhere, is actually a much more agile organization. I think that's something that we need to consider because, and I've had this conversation with folks in Washington for the past, year and a half. We don't really kind of know what to do with Wagner just yet. This isn't a traditional terrorist group. It's not a conventional military. And for some reasons, it just breaks our brain as we kind of sit and try to talk about a different category. And, we'll designate them as a transnational criminal organization. But so what? What are the implications of that on the back end? And I think, even something as simple as the Little Green Men episode shows that our bureaucracy can be pretty slow to respond to these things and to kind of put together some kind of a, strategy to counter or combat what we're seeing.
Yeah, well, what should we be doing? You're right. The bureaucracy is slow. We tend to be risk averse. We tend to be, if we can't categorize classified things according to some law or policy, we can be paralyzed. But what would a U.S. strategy to counter Wagner and the other Russian private military and security contractors look like?
I don't even know that it's a separate strategy, but it's about kind of, again, being there, right? So I look back to 2018, the incident at Conoco Fields where, as many as several hundred Wagner guys were wiped out. That's part of it is, remaining in theater and making very clear what the U.S. will and won't tolerate. I think, some might argue that the French were really kind of pushed around in West Africa. And when you withdraw under those circumstances, the Russians read that as one thing, weakness. And I think you also see jihadist groups too taking advantage of that, not only filling the power vacuums, but saying, hey, maybe we'll take a shot at these guys because clearly they don't want to be involved in this, right? And it only takes, it's reminiscent of what bin Laden's dialogue looked like after Somalia in the early 90s, right? He had concluded from that the U.S. was a paper tiger. And, rather than the U.S. withdrawing from that part of the world, making us safer, it actually made us less safe because, several years later, you saw the bombings in East Africa, followed by the Cole and 9/11. They smelled blood, they smelled weakness, and they kind of pushed the envelope. And I think Wagner's likely to do the same.
Yeah, you mentioned the February 2018 Conoco oil fields incident in Syria, which was after that, we had very few problems with the Russians and Wagner on the east side of the Euphrates until we pulled off the Turkish border and allowed them in. But I think that's a good example. It's a good analog for what we're seeing here. I mean, Russia does understand force, and the Wagner Group understands force, and they tested the U.S. And lost, and then adopted a bit of a different approach in Syria, at least. So, since we're talking about dozens of dead Wagner fighters, let's talk about Mali. Something happened, we know. When was this? In late July. I keep reading somewhere between 50 and 80 Wagner members were killed, others captured by Tuareg militants in northern Mali. So what happened here, and what does it mean for Russia's presence in Africa? Let me go to you first on this, Chris.
Yeah, so I think all of us here are probably written a little bit about this particular event, but the short story was I think we were a little blind on who ordered the kind of the mission towards the Algerian border. I think what we were ultimately seeing is Wagner trying to capitalize on some momentum that it had achieved back in November of 2023 with the capture of the strategic city of Kidal, and trying to illustrate its kind of prowess as a counterinsurgent force. And they ultimately bit off more than they could chew, got into a scuffle with a Tuareg separatist group up near the Algerian border. For a whole bunch of different reasons, then encountered the Al Qaeda affiliate JNM in an ambush, and we ended up with, as you noted, 50 to 80 Wagner personnel killed. I don't know the numbers on the Malian armed forces, or at least it's escaping me at the moment. But they also suffered a serious loss in this particular event, and it kind of showed the limits of Wagner as a counterterrorism force, and also highlights the complexities of Mali's security landscape. We're talking about terrorist operatives and separatist groups all coming together to try to combat, the Wagner enterprise that was here. So that's kind of where it stood and what it means. I think you have to speculate a little bit about what it means. I kind of have two different ideas. One is, and I've suggested this before, the Wagner / Africa Corps contingent there is really auditioning for the Malian junta. So this kind of signals to them that they're willing to lose fighters, right? And this is a credible signal that maybe the French were unable to signal to the Malian armed forces. I don't want to discount the fact that the French lost something like 59 soldiers throughout their counterterrorism mission from 2013 to their withdrawal in 2022. But we're talking about basically that same number in one firefight. And Wagner's basically able to then sell that as a credible commitment thing to the Malian junta. The other element is there's some speculative reporting coming out that there was some infighting between the Malian armed forces and Wagner over the mission and its outcome that might suggest they would pack their bags and leave. I'm a little skeptical about that particular reasoning, just because they've invested a ton. It's been geopolitically valuable for the Russian state, but nonetheless, it's highlighting this potential tension between the Wagner personnel and the Malian armed forces that could spell trouble in the near future.
Mm-hmm. And as long as we're speculating, or maybe without venturing too far down the road of speculation, there have been pretty consistent reports that Ukraine was in some way, or is in some way, involved in countering Wagner and the Africa Corps. in Africa. So let me turn to you, Rafi. What do we know about this, and what's a responsible sort of what's a responsible understanding of Ukraine's role in Africa right now?
Yeah, it is very hard to tell. I think Ukrainian leaders have been a little bit coy about what exactly is going on, and for good reason. I mean, it makes sense to be discreet when you're getting involved in countries where perhaps you haven't made um, any sort of kind of political agreement with the acting leadership of the country, where you're getting involved and potentially working with a separatist group like the Tuaregs, which we think is potentially the case in Mali. It seems very likely that there has been some level of Ukrainian involvement there, providing some sort of, whether it's intelligence, whether it's reconnaissance, something like that, but not any sort of kinetic aspect to support the Tuareg activities against Wagner. I think a lot of that kind of points to how much the Ukrainians want to fight Wagner, kind of in any possible location. However, there are a lot of potential, negative factors that could come up here. In a lot of ways, the Tuaregs are working with Janum, and which is an Al Qaeda affiliate. So there's kind of the worry that Ukraine might be a third party kind of partner working with another partner who's also working with an Al Qaeda affiliate. So that has all sorts of problems if that is the case. And then there's also the possibility that Ukraine is involved in Sudan, which, as we kind of said already, is its own mess at this point. It seems like the Ukrainians have been supporting SAF, which, as I had mentioned before, has also been supported by Russia. So it's really confusing as to whether it makes sense to deploy in these places to fight Wagner Group, while at the same time you're partnering with all of these other folks who are maybe a little bit unsavory. I would say that it might have some negative effects down the road.
Mm-hmm. Colin, anything to add on this?
Yeah, I think the fact that we're talking about the Ukrainians being in Africa potentially to counter Wagner is confirmation of, you've all heard the expression, all politics is local, and my kind of add on to that is that today all conflict is global. So no matter what is taking place between the Russians and the Ukrainians in Ukraine, it's going to spill over the borders. And I think, the fact that we've been talking about, and I wrote a piece in the LA Times, I think 2 years ago, about this, the potential for Wagner attacks in Europe, right? And the Russians to do some kind of destabilizing attacks there. And there's been a number of incidents that have been murky, to say the least, of arms depots being blown up in Czech Republic and Bulgaria, and other things happening in the UK. So I think, it goes back to the point I was making earlier, that this is now an organization that's getting reps, that's diversifying its skill set, that's increasing its interoperability with other forces, and it just becomes a more useful tool. And we've made this analogy before. I think Wagner is very much like a Swiss Army knife. It can do a lot of different things in a lot of different theaters. And that's the point, right? That's what makes something like this so valuable. And it shows why the Kremlin is so reticent to relinquish, control over such a useful tool. Even if at the height of kind of Prigozhin's power, Wagner had kind of grown too big to fail, or too autonomous anyway, and it made the Kremlin feel a bit vulnerable. And so now it's saying we're reclaiming, we're kind of bringing it back under our umbrella and getting ready to use this in a number of theaters. Look, anytime there's a destabilizing action anywhere, Venezuela, right? Everyone's going, oh, here comes Wagner, right? And the fact that there's almost an expectation that these guys are going to show up shows you just how ubiquitous they are in geopolitics today.
Yeah, it's funny because we've been so concerned about both vertical escalation and horizontal escalation of the conflict in Ukraine. And I mean, there's an argument that it is horizontally escalated long since. And in fact, Russia has seen itself as at war in some form or fashion with the US and most of the West for a decade or more. So, yeah, I mean, it's a good point that Ukraine is now also finding ways to hurt Russia outside of the borders of Ukraine and Russia. But it's also paying a bit of a diplomatic price for that. Chris, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think the coy nature of or the ambiguity surrounding whether or not Ukraine intelligence was involved at all in any capacity with the attack in northern Mali. There are certain advantages to it. The fear it puts into the Wagner personnel, the concern it puts into Russia, it cuts the value of the Wagner brand and the Africa Corps brand to future clients or potential clients of that entity. But the diplomatic price here is both Mali and then Niger quickly thereafter broke diplomatic relations with Kyiv, and that's consequential if you're trying to win friends and defeat your enemies and other theaters outside of where you're directly in conflict. So it's just something to suggest that it's not just a win-win for Ukraine in this case.
I'd also note that the Ukrainian came out with a video basically supporting Ukrainian involvement in Mali, and he was immediately called into to their Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Senegal, presumably to be told off for doing this, which I think is important because whereas Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso are all involved in their own alliance, Senegal is very much a westward-leaning country, or at least a country that's very interested in non-intervention. They've voted, I think, to abstain in all or most of the resolutions on both Ukraine and Russia. So I think it's very important to see the possibility and the potential for problems down the road for Ukraine for involvement like this.
Yeah, I mean, just like the Kursk operation, it is potentially high risk, high reward, right? I mean, Kursk pulled troops from the line in places like Pokrovsk and Chasiv Yar, Kharkiv, where they were under pretty intense pressure from the Russians. But it's also, I read today over 1,200 kilometers of land that the Ukrainians claim to control in Russia now, and over 100 settlements and almost 600 POWs. So, and I think Africa represents their involvement in Africa, whatever form it takes, represents another risky but potentially high reward, or at least if not a reward to Ukraine directly, punishment for Russia in Africa. So, and of course, Africa is much more than a playground for external powers. But we've talked Russia, we've talked Ukraine. There are other countries either considering or already involving themselves in Africa through similar organizations like Wagner, sort of quasi-military or paramilitary organizations. Rafi, can you talk a little bit about who that is and what they're doing?
Sure thing. So I think the big one that we want to talk about here is Sadat. It's a Turkish PMC that is allegedly involved in both Burkina Faso and Niger, although they won't admit it. Turkey is also very much just involved across the board in Africa. They've been involved in the Somalia-Ethiopia negotiations that are going on because that conflict is also simmering once again. But the big news is that they're allegedly sending Syrian mercenaries. So these are pro-Turkey Syrian fighters who have been transshipped through Turkey to Burkina Faso and Niger, and they're allegedly working alongside Africa Corps in these countries, fighting jihadist groups. Of course, this creates a bunch of issues. The biggest one is that in Syria, these groups were often fighting, whether it was Wagner Group or Russia-backed groups. It's kind of hard to see them working side by side with the Russians. And it's based on reports, it sounds like that's already created some problems. Then the other issue, of course, is that a lot of these are Sunni fighters, and they're going up against Sunni jihadist groups. You can kind of take that for what you will, but it could definitely create problems in the future.
And I think the UAE also is at least mooting the idea of some sort of Africa deployment. What do we know about that?
Yeah, so there again unconfirmed reports that the UAE is mulling what they're terming a foreign legion in the French foreign legion style. All of these reports have been denied by the companies involved, so that suggests that there's been a lot of back and forth on this. But the UAE does have a history of using mercenary companies, especially in Yemen. They've actually employed some American companies in some pretty bloody activities in Yemen, so it's not unlikely that they would do a similar thing in Africa as well. They've also been known to use child soldiers, all of that sort of thing. So there's the fear that they might do that sort of thing in Sudan, in Libya. So it doesn't look very good, unfortunately. And I think using the Foreign Legion kind of moniker is one way of whitewashing the entire thing. Whether that's effective is another question entirely.
Yeah, I mean, disentangling all of this is not easy. Certainly, you guys are probably better positioned than anyone to do it. Let me, Colin, and then Chris. Let me turn to you guys for any closing thoughts on this.
I think, one of the big questions that we kind of attempt to grapple with in the book that we're working on is, what do other countries learn from watching the rise and fall and the evolution of the Wagner Group? Is this something that countries look at and find as an attractive model? Is it an attractive model, but with much different guardrails? I think, certainly we talk all the time about violent non-state actors. This is just another flavor of that. And whether you want to talk about the Russian hybrid warfare approach or China's conception of the gray zone, I think I'm pretty confident that we're going to see a lot more PMCs in the future used in different creative ways. And I think this is a kind of real world battle laboratory that we're seeing now. If you look at the use of drones in Libya, right? Libya is kind of. I had a piece a couple of years ago in Defense One saying, what's happening now in Libya gives you a sense of what the future of warfare looks like. Foreign fighters, drones, everybody just kind of dumped in there, and various powers on the outside pulling the strings. And I think that is the type of a conflict that you really learn a lot from when you watch how different players kind of act. And look, again, if we're talking about great power competition, it's not just the great powers that are involved. It's that next tier, or the so-called middle powers. It's the countries like Turkey with Sadat. It's the UAE. Everybody wants to get in, and the barriers to entry have been lowered because of technology, because of the ease with which foreign fighters can be recruited. And there you go. I think we're going to see a lot more conflicts that look like that moving forward.
Thanks, Colin. And Chris, wrap it up for us. What's one or two big takeaways from this latest foray of the Wagner Group or the Russian PMSCs into Africa?
Yeah, you're gonna ask me to wrap it up, and I feel like we're just scratching the surface with some of these topics, but I think Colin's highlighted several important things about emulation and a desire by a variety of different autocratic states to maybe replicate something akin to Wagner/Africa Corps. One thing I think that's important to consider is, as the Kremlin is commandeered the Wagner enterprise, they've really been able to continue punching above their weight in foreign policy in Africa with small deployments, low cost, small deployments to places like Burkina Faso and Niger. We're talking about displacing a U.S. mission that had been there for a decade or over a decade with 100 Africa Corps, a detachment of 100 Africa Corps personnel. And in Burkina Faso, very similar numbers. And so if you're a dictator aspiring to export security in a similar fashion, you can see the real value add in punching above your weight in the area of foreign policy by just standing up an outfit that's quite small and in my position not that capable, because we've seen Burkina Faso and Niger both struggle to combat fueling jihadist insurgencies and from JNM and the Islamic State and the Sahel. The other is we talked a little bit about what we can do to try to combat these organizations. So just briefly, one of the things is it's difficult to work with these military junta governments because there's a lot of legal restrictions. We start thinking about Section 70088 restrictions that say, hey, we can't provide direct military support for coup governments. But I do think there are creative ways in which we can provide humanitarian support, internal security support, and training to kind of circumvent that central government. And, it sounds a little bit nefarious, but one of the things is we have to get creative in foreign policy to compete with Russia and to undercut the Africa Corps in some of these places that it's kind of taken root. So that's kind of where I stand on maybe the takeaway. And then lastly, just maybe publicize their failures and their limitations. When they do shoot themselves in the foot with the event that took place in northern Mali, it's really important to amplify that kind of shortcoming as as Wagner/Africa Corps as a counterterrorism partner, because I do think that there are people watching. There are other states and other regimes paying attention to what's going on, and that isn't to say that we want to abandon Mali or Niger or Burkina Faso or you name it, where Africa Corps has taken root, but it is to suggest that, given our limitations, one of the best things we can do is highlight the Russians' shortcoming.
Yeah, it's a great way to sum it up. And so thanks for that, Chris. And yeah, you mentioned a call for creativity, and calls for creativity in American foreign policy are both appropriate and probably useless, because we are historically notoriously creativity challenged, right? We're a lowest common denominator foreign policy making body, and that's just the way it is. But I think you're right to point that out. We have to start thinking. We have to start thinking outside of the categories of thinking that we're used to thinking in. So, Colin, you mentioned the book. You guys have a book coming out through Columbia University Press somewhere around a year from now, right?
If all goes according to plan, yeah, we'll be writing on Moscow's mercenaries, the rise and fall of the Wagner Group, or something similar to that, depending on what we settle on. But yeah, draft will be delivered on Labor Day, and hopefully we'll be able to have it out there by next fall.
That's great. I look forward to reading it, and I'm sure our listeners do too. So look for it from Columbia University Press a year or so from now. Chris, Colin, Rafi, thank you very much for joining me on Chain Reaction today. Thanks for tuning in to Chain Reaction, a podcast of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, examining the political, security, economic, and social trends shaping Europe and Eurasia. Throughout the year, we're talking with experts about developments in Russia's war in Ukraine, the new European security order, the past, present, and future of the Baltic states, Russia's political economy, and great power competition in the region. Note that the views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of FPRI. I'm your host, Dr. Bob Hamilton, head of Eurasia Research at FPRI. Visit us at fpri.org for more on today's topic and many others in the world of foreign policy and national security. Thanks for listening. See you soon.